Welcome, my friend, and thank you for joining me tonight for another restful journey into the past. As the world outside settles into stillness, I invite you to slow your breathing, soften your thoughts, and drift with me into history's quieter corners. Perhaps you'll share with me, where are you listening from? And what time is it in your part of the world? It's a comforting thought, isn't it? All of us, scattered across so many places, yet gathered here in this one peaceful moment. If stories like these help you rest, I hope you'll stay with me. There are countless more nights of gentle discovery ahead. Tonight's story may change how you see the link between drugs, power, and empire. Many people imagine the Opium Wars as simple trade disagreements, but the truth is far more unsettling. These wars were not accidents of commerce, they were among the most calculated acts of chemical warfare in history. Addiction was not a side effect, but the very strategy itself. And by the end of this tale, you'll understand how one small island nation used flowers to weaken the mightiest empire the world had ever known. But before we reach the battles and betrayals, let us pause and see why this story matters today. The methods born during the Opium Wars did not disappear when the century closed. They shifted, evolved, and still ripple through our world, shaping politics, economies, and the lives of millions. To understand them is to recognize patterns that continue to guide nations, often quietly, beneath the surface. And so, before the gunfire and the treaties, before the bloodshed and broken trust, we must meet the first player in this deadly game. Not a general or an admiral, but a single man, driven by profit, and remembered for the suffering he spread. His name was William Jardine, a Scottish surgeon who would abandon healing for trade, and whose ambition would help plunge millions into addiction. Jardine was a small man, barely 5 feet tall, with sharp gray eyes and a constant frown. Yet his determination was vast, the kind from which empires draw their strength. What makes his tale especially haunting is its cruel irony. He began not as a dealer of poison, but as a doctor, sworn to preserve life. In the year 1814, Jardine arrived in Canton as a ship's physician for the East India Company. At first, his role was to mend wounds and cure the sick. But soon, he saw something that would change his path forever, the astonishing wealth flowing from opium sold to Chinese buyers. In that moment, his course shifted. A man of medicine became a merchant of misery, and the quiet seed of one of history's darkest chapters was planted. Now, let us picture the scene in Canton's foreign quarter. Along the banks of the Pearl River rose vast stone warehouses, their walls built so thick they could withstand even cannon fire. Inside those silent fortresses, chest after chest of raw opium was stacked like bricks of gold, each one worth more than a lifetime of ordinary labor. The air itself was heavy, filled with the sweet, cloying scent of the drug, blending with the salt of the sea breeze to create an atmosphere both rich and unsettling, wealth born from human sorrow. But William Jardine was not satisfied to simply watch this trade unfold. He longed to control it. By 1825, he had joined forces with another ambitious Scotsman, James Matheson. Together, under the name Jardine Matheson and Company, they built what many historians now call the world's first true international drug cartel. They wielded private armies, bribed officials, and created a vast distribution network that spanned oceans and continents. And yet, the most chilling part of their story was not the scale of their business, it was the precision of their methods. Jardine and Matheson were not just traders, they were architects of addiction. They studied Chinese society with ruthless care, seeking out the most vulnerable. Their strategy began with wealthy merchants, then government officials, then soldiers, laborers, and finally entire communities. The process was as deliberate as it was devastating. Agents of Jardine's company would sail into coastal towns with gifts of free opium. They hosted lavish gatherings for local elites, where the drug was served in ornate pipes alongside laughter, music, and talk of trade. Soon, the pleasures of these evenings turned into dependency. New customers, bound by craving, became unknowing ambassadors, introducing the poison to friends, family, and colleagues. Within months, whole circles of society dissolved into a haze of addiction. The true brilliance, though perhaps it is better to call it cruelty, lay in the economic design. Unlike merchants who sold cloth or tea or spices, Jardine had created a business where the product itself demanded more and more of itself. Each new addict needed greater quantities of opium to quiet the body's hunger. This meant demand never ended, never lessened. The very success of the trade guaranteed ever-growing misery. And while this was unfolding along China's coast, thousands of miles away, in the fertile lands of Bengal, another figure was quietly shaping the other half of this dark equation. His name was Francis Rawdon Hastings, the Governor-General of British India. With sharp administrative vision, Hastings transformed opium from a small cottage trade into a vast machine capable of feeding millions of addicts. His challenge was monumental: how to draw immense wealth from India while ruling more than 300 million people with only a thin British presence. His solution was devastating in its elegance. He would turn India's farmland into a weapon against China, and at the same time, fill the empire's treasury with opium's profits. The change began in 1818, when Hastings introduced his monopoly system. No longer would farmers freely choose what to plant, nor sell to the highest bidder. Instead, the British government dictated the crop. Indian farmers were ordered to grow only opium poppies, their prices set in advance, low enough to keep them in debt, high enough to enrich the empire. Thus, the entire cycle, from seed to harvest to sale, was bound to Britain's control. And so, if you close your eyes, you can almost see it, the Bengali countryside in harvest season. Fields upon fields of pale white and soft pink poppies, stretching endlessly toward the horizon. A landscape as beautiful as it was tragic, each blossom a quiet part of the machinery of empire, destined not for joy or celebration, but for sorrow carried across the seas. Beneath those delicate petals lay the hidden source of untold misery. Across Bengal, thousands of Indian families tended the fields, many unaware that their labor was fueling what would become one of the most devastating drug epidemics in history. Even children, some no older than 8, learned to score the green poppy pods with tiny knives, coaxing out the pale, milky sap that would one day harden into opium. The processing centers established under Hastings's system were feats of industrial precision. In cities such as Patna and Benares, immense factories employed thousands of workers. There, the sticky resin was refined and molded into uniform products, carefully graded for different markets. The finest opium, known as Patna, was set aside for China's wealthy elites, who could afford its high price. Lower grades were pressed into bricks for common sale, ensuring that addiction would spread across every level of society, from the noble to the laborer. Hastings's true innovation, however, was not only in cultivation or processing, it was in finance. Through what became known as the opium revenue system, he ensured that profits did more than enrich merchants. Every coin earned from opium sales was funneled into Britain's imperial machine, paying for soldiers, administrators, and the infrastructure that stretched from Calcutta to Singapore. In effect, every pipe lit in Canton helped fund British expansion across Asia. Chinese dependency had become the silent engine of empire. The numbers tell the scale of this transformation. By 1830, British India was producing more than 4,000 chests of opium each year, with each chest holding roughly 140 pounds of the refined drug. That supply alone could sustain nearly 2 million regular users, and the numbers only grew with each passing season. Hastings had designed a machine of terrible efficiency. Indian agriculture turned seamlessly into Chinese addiction, all for the profit of empire. While Jardine constructed his vast distribution network and Hastings perfected the system of production, the human cost was playing out in countless Chinese homes. The true tragedy was not measured in chests or profits, but in the unraveling of ordinary lives. One such life was that of Chen Wei, a silk merchant from Guangzhou. His story mirrors millions of others, each one a thread in a larger tapestry of suffering. Chen Wei was the image of Confucian ideals, devoted to family, skilled in business, and committed to his community. At just 35, he managed a flourishing silk enterprise that had been passed down for 6 generations. His warehouse supported more than 50 workers, and his trade route stretched from Beijing to the ports of Southeast Asia. Men like Chen Wei were the foundation of China's stability and prosperity. His first encounter with opium came almost by chance, at a dinner hosted by one of Jardin's Chinese partners. The setting was refined, a tea house overlooking the Pearl River, its painted screens filled with images of harmony and nature. It seemed the perfect place for conversation and opportunity. His host, a man named Li Ming, was already in opium's grip. With practiced ease, Li presented smoking not as vice but as art, comparing it to wine tasting or poetry recitals. That first pipe felt harmless. Chen Wei found himself unusually relaxed, light in spirit, and confident about the future of his business. His words flowed more smoothly, his charm seemed brighter, and every possibility appeared within reach. When Li suggested they meet again the following week to discuss a lucrative silk contract, Chen Wei agreed without hesitation, never suspecting the trap before him. Within 3 months, those occasional gatherings became daily habits. His business discussions now revolved around smoke-filled rooms, and before long, Chen Wei discovered he could not make decisions or negotiate deals without first inhaling the drug. The merchant who once prided himself on sharp judgment and disciplined thought had become dependent on a haze that clouded both. The change in his body was slow but relentless. His weight melted away as appetite deserted him. His once clear eyes sank into dark circles, bloodshot and weary, no amount of rest able to restore their brightness. His hands trembled when he tried to write, forcing him to rely on clerks for tasks he had once handled with ease. But it was not only the body that suffered. The deepest wounds lay hidden, in the quiet unraveling of the mind and spirit, losses far greater than any decline in trade or fortune. In time, Chen Wei's dependence deepened into something far more frightening. Whenever he could not reach his supply, waves of anxiety overwhelmed him, panic attacks that left him gasping for air, drenched in sweat and trembling. The confident leader who once guided his business with clarity and strength now lived in desperation, chained to a substance that hollowed him from within. Business partners who once sought his wisdom quietly withdrew. They recognized what many across China were beginning to see, the unmistakable signs of advanced addiction. For Chen Wei's family, the consequences were devastating. Money that once expanded warehouses and secured trade routes now vanished into Jardin's network. Each day's opium cost more than a worker's monthly wage. The silk merchant's legacy, 6 generations in the making, was bleeding away. Within just 2 years, he was forced to sell family land and property, severing a chain of prosperity that had withstood wars, famines, and political turmoil. His tragedy was not an isolated one. Like stones thrown into a pond, its ripples spread outward. What happened to Chen Wei was happening to thousands, merchants, officials, farmers, and soldiers, each one caught in the net of carefully engineered dependency. And yet, Chen Wei's fall carried meaning beyond his personal misfortune. His silk business had been a vital link in China's trade network, connecting rural weavers with city markets and buyers abroad. With his decline, that chain broke, disrupting supply lines that had endured for centuries. The damage stretched far beyond one family, it shook villages and towns hundreds of miles from Canton. The imperial court was beginning to take notice. But Emperor Daoguang and his advisors viewed opium not as an act of foreign aggression but as a moral weakness. They issued stern proclamations, urging virtue and discipline, while failing to recognize the industrial scale of the assault unfolding against their nation. It was in this moment that a new figure stepped onto the stage, Lin Zexu, the imperial commissioner whose courage would ignite the conflict history remembers as the Opium Wars. Lin was, in many ways, what Chen Wei had once been, but magnified, his loyalty and brilliance dedicated not to a single household, but to the empire itself. Lin Zexu was tall and commanding, his gaze sharp, his mind unclouded by corruption. He embodied the Confucian ideal of the scholar official, brilliant, incorruptible, convinced that Chinese civilization stood at the pinnacle of human achievement. Through decades of service, he had risen not by favor but by merit, solving challenges that had defeated others. And when news of the opium epidemic reached Beijing, Emperor Daoguang knew there was only one man to send. In March of 1839, Lin Zexu arrived in Guangzhou with a singular mission, to end the opium trade once and for all. Unlike previous officials, he saw clearly that this was no mere question of smuggling or corruption. This was a form of warfare, waged with chemistry and commerce, designed to weaken China while enriching her enemies. His first act revealed both his intelligence and, perhaps, his tragic miscalculation. Lin wrote a letter to Queen Victoria herself, appealing to justice and morality. With the grace of Chinese diplomacy, he laid out the hypocrisy. Opium was forbidden in Britain, yet British merchants were flooding China with poison. If it was unfit for Englishmen, why should it be forced upon the Chinese? But the Queen never read his words. The letter was intercepted by British officials, who saw at once the danger it posed. If the British public understood the empire's deep entanglement in drug trafficking, political pressure might threaten the entire enterprise. Its suppression revealed the truth. Britain's government was no passive bystander but an active partner in Jardin's cartel. Meanwhile, Lin Zexu pressed forward. He surrounded Canton's foreign quarter with troops, cutting off supplies and demanding that every merchant surrender their opium and pledge never to trade in it again. For 6 tense weeks, the siege held. To Jardin and his fellow merchants, this was not simply an inconvenience. It was a direct threat to their fortunes, their networks, and the system of perpetual profit they had so carefully built. Lin Zexu's demands endangered not only their current wealth but the future of an empire of addiction. Their reaction laid bare the truth. They did not negotiate. They did not compromise. They turned at once to Britain's military for protection. This was not the response of honest traders, but of criminals who had always intended to wield violence when challenged. And Britain, far from restraining them, gave its full support. Foreign Secretary Lord Palmerston, who tracked opium's revenues with care, authorized military action under the polished phrase of free trade. The decision revealed that opium had become too vital to imperial finances to abandon. Britain was ready to wage war for its preservation. As officials schemed in distant halls of power, the cost of this decision fell upon ordinary families. In villages and fields, the suffering grew. Let us turn now to one such household, the Li family, rice farmers just outside Canton, whose story reflects how addiction was seeping into the very roots of Chinese society. For generations, Li Guangming had tended the same rice paddies his ancestors had worked for more than 2 centuries. The Li family's small farm had always been enough. Their rice fields produced food to nourish the household and a modest surplus to sell at the local market. Like countless farming families, Li Guangming lived by the rhythms of the seasons, planting in spring, tending through the warmth of summer, harvesting in autumn, and preparing for winter in the quieter months. It was a way of life unchanged for generations, steady and reliable. But the opium crisis crept into this quiet village not through merchants or soldiers, but through Guangming's eldest son, Li Jun. Bright, ambitious, and eager to lift his family beyond subsistence, Li Jun had traveled to bustling Canton in search of opportunity. There he secured a coveted position in a silk export warehouse, work that promised advancement and the chance to bring prosperity home. Yet the warehouse belonged to one of Chen Wei's former business partners, a man whose own descent into addiction had warped the workplace itself. Employees were required to smoke opium together, under the guise of team building and stress relief. The truth was simpler and darker: addiction bound workers to their employer, leaving them too dependent to seek freedom elsewhere. Li Jun's first encounter came during what his supervisor called a celebration of successful contracts. He was ushered into an ornate private room above the warehouse, its walls adorned with expensive paintings, its low tables spread with elaborate pipes and smoking trays. Cushions of silk invited comfort, and the atmosphere suggested sophistication and success. The effects seemed entirely positive. The young man felt his worries dissolve, the chronic anxiety of leaving home replaced by calm confidence. Words flowed easily, optimism surged, and for the first time since departing the village, he felt truly capable of shaping his destiny. When his supervisor invited him to meet regularly for career discussions, Li Jun eagerly agreed, unaware he was stepping into a carefully laid trap. Within 6 months, he was spending more on opium than he earned. Letters home, once filled with bright plans and affectionate updates, turned into desperate pleas for money. His father, bewildered by the sudden change in tone, sold portions of the family's rice harvest to meet his son's needs. He could not comprehend what held Li Jun so tightly, only that the boy he had raised was drowning in debts he would not explain. The pattern grew worse. As tolerance built, Li Jun needed more opium to feel its effects. His work performance declined. The quick-thinking, confident young man became slow, lethargic, and unable to focus. Within a year, he lost his warehouse position and slipped into day labor, earning barely enough to survive while still funneling every coin he touched into the drug. The change in spirit was even more painful than the loss of income. His letters grew manipulative, filled with excuses and promises that never came true. The son who once dreamed of lifting his family into prosperity now saw them only as a source of money to sustain his habit. Back in the village, Li Guangming faced choices that no father should endure. His son's requests grew larger just as the farm's output shrank. Forced to sell rice before harvest at low prices, he watched his ancestral land diminish year after year. The farm that had nourished generations was slowly being sacrificed to feed an addiction he could not even understand. And they were not alone. The same story was repeating across the countryside. Young men who had left in search of opportunity returned hollow-eyed, or never returned at all. The extended families and village elders, who had guided their people through floods, famines, and political unrest, found themselves powerless. Their traditional systems of shared labor and mutual aid could not mend this new kind of wound. Addiction was not a hardship to be endured together, it was a private prison that isolated its victims and drained entire households. The Li family's struggle was a mirror of countless others, as opium seeped beyond the coastal cities into the fertile heart of China. Farmers who had guarded their lands through centuries of storms and wars were losing everything, not to nature, not to armies, but to a drug they had never seen before, sold by foreigners they had never met, for reasons they could never fathom. The great upheaval shaking China's farming heartlands was not an accident at all. It was, in truth, exactly what Jardine and his business partners had long anticipated. A weakened, dependent empire would be far easier to bend toward foreign trade and influence. Every household undone by addiction was not only a family tragedy, but also a calculated step in the wider struggle of imperial competition. And so, when spring of 1840 arrived, the world seemed to hold its breath. The stage was set for violence that would reshape the bond between East and West for generations. Lin Zexu's moral crusade stood directly in the path of Britain's economic ambitions. While countless families like the Lees paid the price for choices made in faraway counting houses and government halls, the first sparks of what history would call the Opium Wars were preparing to ignite. Yet, in truth, the deepest battle had already been unfolding quietly, for decades, inside the minds, hearts, and bodies of ordinary people whose lives had become weapons in the clash of empires. Then came the discovery that shattered Lin Zexu's last illusions. Hidden inside the foreign warehouses lay more than 20,000 chests of opium, an immense store that could have supplied whole provinces for an entire year. The sheer volume revealed the true nature of the scheme. This was not simple smuggling by a few reckless traders. It was industrial warfare dressed in the costume of commerce. Standing before row upon row of wooden chests stamped with the seal of the British East India Company, Lin Zexu finally saw the truth: these were not medicines, nor even mere drugs. They were weapons, carefully prepared and deliberately deployed to hollow out Chinese society from within. A cold, steady fury took root in his heart, guiding every decision that followed. His resolve was simple and unwavering: all of it must be destroyed. To let it pass into the markets would hasten the ruin of millions. To return it would signal weakness to the powers testing China's will. And so began one of history's most unusual spectacles. For 23 days, thousands of workers dug deep trenches by the shoreline. They mixed the confiscated opium with seawater and lime, and washed the blackened slurry into the sea. Fishermen would later tell of waters that turned dark for miles, and of a heavy, cloying sweetness that drifted over the Pearl River Delta, hanging like a funeral shroud. Yet while Lin Zexu sought to cleanse the empire of its poison, events were stirring far beyond his reach. In London, news of the destruction reached Parliament at a moment of great financial strain. The empire's balance sheets told a stark truth: profits from Indian opium now underpinned nearly one-third of British administration in India, while also filling government coffers through trade duties. Without that revenue, the colonial system itself seemed at risk. And so the decision to march toward war was not born in the halls of strategy, nor from dreams of grandeur. It was made in the pages of ledgers. The accountants concluded that war would be cheaper than letting China ban the trade. The empire's course was set, not by vision, but by profit margins. Meanwhile, back in Canton, the destruction of the stockpiles had its own terrible cost. In the dim corners of opium dens, thousands of dependent users suddenly found themselves cut off. What followed was not relief, but a humanitarian crisis. Withdrawal swept through the city with the force of a storm. Dr. Wang Shihan, a respected physician trained at the Imperial Medical Academy in Beijing, watched in sorrow as wave after wave of suffering souls arrived at his door. He treated men and women in the grip of violent tremors, racked by vomiting, haunted by hallucinations, and driven to despair so deep that some chose death over enduring the pain of recovery. What weighed most heavily upon the doctor was not only the suffering, but the cruel twist of irony. Many of these very patients had first turned to opium on the advice of physicians, men of healing who had themselves been misled. For foreign merchants had spread pamphlets across Canton, claiming opium to be a miraculous cure for pain, digestion, and countless other ills. What had been offered as medicine had become a chain of misery. And so, beneath the surface of a vast empire, the gentle rhythm of ordinary life had been broken. The soil, the families, the healers, all were caught in a storm of shadows, their struggles quietly shaping the destiny of nations. Respected Chinese physicians, many of them trusted voices in their communities, had unknowingly guided their patients toward opium based on the false promises spread by foreign merchants. Those fraudulent claims, cloaked in the language of medicine, had set the stage for a hidden epidemic that was now erupting into full view. The sudden crisis of withdrawal revealed just how deeply opium had embedded itself in Chinese society. Dr. Wang's small clinic, originally meant to serve a quiet neighborhood of perhaps 5,000 souls, was now overwhelmed. More than 800 desperate patients crowded through its doors, each suffering the torment of opium withdrawal. And the scene in his clinic was only a glimpse of the larger picture. Across Canton, in neighborhood after neighborhood, the same anguish played out, as the disrupted supply exposed the full magnitude of dependence that had been silently growing for years. Among all those who came to Dr. Wang, it was the children who weighed most heavily on his heart. Families had slipped into addiction together, some parents even placing the pipe into the hands of children as young as 10. For some, it was an attempt to share their own fleeting escape from reality. For others, it was the desperate act of mothers and fathers too weakened by withdrawal to properly care for their young. The result was devastating: child addicts whose bodies and minds were scarred for life, their futures stolen by a poison sold as medicine. Here, in the faces of these children, the true cost of Lin Zexu's bold destruction was laid bare: immediate suffering, unbearable to witness. Yet behind this human tragedy, political storms were gathering strength. In Calcutta, the Governor-General was receiving frantic dispatches. British merchants, whose fortunes rested entirely on the opium trade, were watching their business models crumble in real time. These were not small losses. Many had borrowed vast sums of money, their loans secured against future drug sales that could now never take place. Prominent trading houses across Asia faced bankruptcy, and with them the stability of the colonial economy trembled. But William Jardine had already moved with foresight. Months before Lin Zexu's campaign, he had sailed for London, anticipating this very outcome. Now, as panic spread through Britain's financial markets, Jardine stood ready. His arrival could not have been timed more perfectly. Government officials, alarmed by the crisis, were eager for his guidance. And Jardine gave it to them, crafted not in the language of morality, but in the tones of power and profit. Before ministers, Jardine spoke smoothly, never once mentioning addiction, suffering, or the pleas Lin Zexu had written in his letter to Queen Victoria. Instead, he reframed the conflict with careful precision: trade rights, national honor, the stability of the empire. He warned that if China succeeded in blocking British goods, other colonial territories might soon be emboldened to challenge imperial rule. From India to Southeast Asia, the chain could unravel. To men already worried about unrest across their dominions, this struck a deep chord. Yet it was Jardine's economic reasoning that proved most persuasive. With meticulous figures, he showed how China's defiance threatened to cost the British Treasury over £2 million each year. Factories in Britain's manufacturing towns, dependent on exports for the China trade, would lose thousands of jobs. What had begun as a moral issue was transformed, by numbers on a page, into a question of economic survival. Thus, when the British government announced its decision for military action, the language chosen concealed the truth. In Parliament, Foreign Secretary Palmerston framed the war as a noble defence of free trade and British commercial rights. Not a word was spoken of the drugs destroying Chinese lives. To the public, Britain was not defending drug traffickers, it was upholding the honour of fair commerce. This careful use of words reveals something essential about imperial powers. They waged war for profit, yet told their citizens they fought for principle. China was painted as backward and hostile to modernity, while Britain was portrayed as the champion of progress and law. Conveniently forgotten was the fact that opium was illegal in Britain itself, with traffickers punished by death at home even as their government prepared to defend the trade abroad. Meanwhile, the waters of the Indian Ocean stirred with British warships. The fleet gathered strength, 16 naval vessels, carrying more than 4,000 troops, supported by armed merchantmen and transport ships heavy with supplies. This was not a gesture, not a limited action. It was the deliberate preparation for a full-scale invasion, designed to force China's hand at gunpoint. Admiral George Elliot, leading the expedition, carried orders that revealed the true intent. He was not merely to demand compensation for the destroyed opium, nor simply to protect British merchants. His task was far more sweeping. He was to compel the Chinese government to legalize opium imports, to permit permanent British trading posts, and to accept extraterritorial rights, placing British subjects beyond the reach of Chinese law. These were not negotiations. They were blueprints for colonial subjugation. The opium crisis had become the pretext for something far greater, the dismantling of Chinese sovereignty itself. Britain's vision was to reshape China into a subordinate state, its economy and people bound to foreign will. And yet, as the ships pressed toward Chinese waters, their commanders overlooked one vital truth. For months, Lin Zexu had been preparing. Quietly, with determination, he had been setting defenses in place. Britain was sailing toward confrontation, certain of victory, but in the depths of China's resolve, they would soon discover a force they had underestimated. The first clashes of the Opium War would show the true stakes of this struggle. It was not simply about the right to sell drugs. It was about the very survival of Chinese civilization. And in the middle of these colliding empires were millions of ordinary people, men, women, and children, whose lives had already been broken by addiction, and who now faced the deeper terror of a war waged to keep them suffering. Captain Chen Lynch stood upon the walls of the Bogue forts, his telescope steady in his hands, watching the British fleet draw near. He had fought pirates before, had faced rebels in earlier years, yet nothing in his long service had prepared him for what now approached. The ships advanced in perfect order, their heavy hulls lined with cannons that reached far beyond the range of anything his soldiers could command. But Chen Lynch was not only a commander. He was also a father. 2 years earlier, his own son had fallen into the snare of opium. Standing there on those stone ramparts, gazing at the approaching warships, he understood with painful clarity what this war truly meant. This was not about trade rights or diplomatic formality. This was about the very life of his homeland. The weight of irony pressed on him. As a soldier, he had sworn to defend China from foreign invasion. Yet as a father, he had already seen foreign poisons invade his home, robbing him of the boy he once knew. And now before him came a fleet whose victory would mean countless families sharing the same heartbreak that had already torn through his own. His son, Chen had once been full of promise. He studied diligently, preparing for the imperial examinations, ready to become a scholar in service of the empire. But at a gathering of wealthy classmates, he first encountered the shimmering pipe of opium. Among ambitious, educated youths, smoking was presented as a sign of refinement and success. The decline was swift. Within mere months, Chen brilliant studies faltered. Philosophy and poetry gave way to a hunger for smoke. His long hours of reading were replaced by restless searching for his next indulgence. His father watched helplessly as years of careful learning dissolved into ash. By the time the foreign fleet appeared on the horizon, Chen was no longer a scholar but a shadow, living among Canton's opium dens, feeding his hunger through petty theft and the kindness of strangers. Once full of light, he had become one of the skeletal figures haunting the city's back alleys. Chen knew then what this war would bring. He knew that if Britain triumphed, thousands of other fathers would see their sons wither in the same way, lost to the same foreign smoke. The stakes for Chinese commanders were personal in ways their opponents could not imagine. British officers fought for careers, for imperial glory, for commercial profit. Chinese commanders fought to save their own people from being poisoned by foreign merchants whose soldiers now carried their cause. This difference in purpose shaped the heart of the conflict. For Britain, it was a business venture, backed with guns. For China, it was survival itself. The gap in weapons was vast, yes, but the Chinese still carried advantages unseen by the invader: knowledge of their lands, the strength of local communities who had suffered under opium's grip, and the deep resolve that only comes from defending one's home. And so, when the British fleet drew into position before the Bogue forts, Chen made ready his soldiers, though he knew their chance of victory by conventional means was slim. The battle that followed would reveal both Britain's overwhelming superiority and the courage of those who resisted, fighting not for conquest, but for the lives of their people. When British cannons thundered against the stone walls, they were not merely striking military targets. They were announcing to the world that an empire would use war to protect drug profits. The explosions that shattered the forts were, in truth, defending the warehouses of men like William Jardine, and the epidemic of addiction that filled those warehouses with wealth. The Battle of the Bogue lasted only hours. The courage of Chinese defenders delayed the outcome but could not alter it. Britain's power forced the path toward a treaty, one that would demand China accept endless imports of opium, and, in cruel irony, pay compensation for the very drugs that Lin Zexu had destroyed to shield his people. As smoke drifted from the ruined forts and British Marines prepared to march on Canton, the real victors were not empires or nations. The true winners were the drug merchants, whose wares had sparked the crisis and who now enjoyed the shield of imperial armies. The First Opium War was scarcely begun, and already it was ending in spirit. But the addiction it had been built upon was only reaching its full and ruinous strength. Millions of Chinese, who had never heard the names of William Jardine or Lin Zexu, were about to learn that their lives had become commodities in a market where suffering was measured in silver, and whole societies could be broken for profit. The fall of Chen Linseng's fortress was more than a defeat on the battlefield. It marked the moment when drug trafficking was no longer just a hidden trade, it had become British foreign policy. As the last Chinese cannons went silent and the smoke of battle drifted over the Pearl River, a new chapter in human history began. An empire was now using its fleets and armies not to defend its people, but to secure the right to poison another civilization for profit. And yet, the story did not end with that first loss. The British victory at the Bogue was not the end of Chinese resistance. It was the opening of a longer, harsher campaign, one aimed not only at military positions but at the very institutions that held Chinese society together. What followed showed how carefully the British had studied their adversary. They had learned to target the cultural foundations that supported entire communities. Into this storm stepped Commissioner Qi Shan, the Manchu official who replaced Lin Zexu after the emperor, weary of defeats, decided that avoiding disaster was more important than pursuing moral purity. Qi Shan represented a pragmatic and calculating kind of governance. Where Lin had spoken of right and wrong, Qi saw a crisis that must be managed, not solved. He stood among the ruins of Lin's former headquarters, burdened with an impossible task. The British fleet ruled the coasts, able to strike any port at will. Inland, the withdrawal of opium was tearing cities apart, as officials, merchants, and workers faltered without the daily drug that had bound them in its grip. The empire faced invasion from without, and collapse from within. Qi Shan's solution revealed both his intelligence and his tragic miscalculation. He believed that by negotiating a limited opium trade, he could satisfy British demands while preserving some measure of stability. Imports would be channeled through designated ports. Heavy taxes would discourage excess use. Revenue could be used to fund addiction treatment programs. It sounded reasonable, even careful. But there was a flaw, one fatal misunderstanding. Controlled addiction was an illusion. Opium was designed to create dependency, not moderation. William Jardine and his associates had perfected a trade system that transformed casual users into desperate dependents. There was no such thing as a small opium trade, just as there was no such thing as being slightly pregnant. The negotiations themselves unfolded in a haze of contempt. The British viewed Chinese officials as obstacles to their profits, while Chinese diplomats struggled to grasp the depth of what they faced. Among the British sat Captain Charles Elliot, Superintendent of Trade, a man who embodied the empire's contradictions. A career naval officer, proud of his honor and duty, Elliot was simultaneously defending drug dealers whose work he secretly despised. His private letters to London reveal a man torn between loyalty to his post and disgust for the cause he served. But Elliot's turmoil was a private footnote. Around him, the real catastrophe unfolded in the lives of ordinary families. While quotas and tariffs were debated, men and women were dying from overdoses, from withdrawal, and from the unraveling of the social fabric that had once held their neighborhoods together. Consider the story of the Huang family, silk weavers in Canton whose workshop had stood for 4 generations. Master Huang Daxian employed a dozen skilled workers, producing fine fabric for wealthy patrons. His enterprise was one of countless small workshops that made up the backbone of China's urban economy. The plague of opium entered his household through his most gifted apprentice, a young man named Wuang. Renowned for his delicate hands and flawless eye, Wuang had once been trusted with the family's most important commissions. His introduction to opium came during a customer's celebration, an evening where smoking the drug was framed as refinement, as a symbol of success. The change was swift and heartbreaking. Within months, Wuang's careful precision gave way to trembling hands. Silk patterns that had once been flawless began to falter. Patrons who once sought him out now requested other weavers. The very reputation of the Huang workshop was placed in jeopardy. Master Huang faced the same cruel choice that countless employers now faced. His apprentice was irreplaceable, the fruit of years of training. But his addiction made him unreliable, and at times, even dangerous. And soon, the sickness spread. Other workers began following Wuang's path, smoking during breaks, gathering after hours to indulge. Within 2 years, 8 of the 12 workers were spending more on opium than they earned. The workshop began to unravel. Where once there had been camaraderie and shared pride, there was now suspicion. Tools went missing. Finished silk disappeared. Master Huang was forced to lock cabinets, to patrol his workshop as though it were a prison. The deepest wound, however, was not among the employees, but in the family itself. Huang's teenage son, who had once shown great promise, began experimenting with opium after seeing his father's workers smoke. His enthusiasm for weaving gave way to secret trips to opium dens, where he traded away household valuables for the drug. The ruin of the Huang workshop was not an isolated story. It was one thread in a vast tapestry of destruction. Across China, family businesses were collapsing. Apprenticeships, once sacred, were rotting from within. Social bonds that had endured for centuries were being dissolved by a drug whose true purpose was to unravel the ties of trust and loyalty. And still, in the midst of this slow devastation, the negotiations between Qi Shan and the British pressed forward. But each agreement, each signed paper, each compromise, did not control the disaster. Instead, it widened the cracks, accelerating the unraveling of Chinese society. The Convention of Chuanbi, signed in January 1841, was Qi Shan's careful attempt to find a middle ground, a compromise meant to satisfy British demands while shielding Chinese society from the worst harm. On paper, it seemed measured, almost reasonable. Yet beneath its polite phrases lay a fundamental misunderstanding of addiction, both as a medical condition and a business model. Under the convention, Britain would gain Hong Kong as a permanent trading base, along with $6 million in compensation for the opium destroyed by Lin Zexu. More troublingly, British merchants would enjoy extraterritorial legal protection, ensuring that drug dealers could operate freely on Chinese soil, beyond the reach of Chinese law. This effectively legalized drug trafficking, stripping authorities of the ability to prosecute the foreign merchants whose poison was devastating communities. Qi Shan's tragic miscalculation lay in believing that these merchants would voluntarily limit their operations to protect society. He failed to see that destabilization was the purpose. Jardine and his associates had designed the system deliberately to weaken Chinese institutions while maximizing profits from human suffering. The convention also set a precedent that would echo for decades: military force could protect illegal drug trafficking if profits were large enough and the victims powerless. This principle would later appear wherever colonial powers confronted societies trying to resist substances destroying their people. Even as Qi Shan signed agreements with hope, new players were entering the stage, ready to push the epidemic further. Dent and Company, Jardine's main competitor, introduced strategies that made Jardine's operations seem restrained. Lancelot Dent had studied Jardine's success and saw that targeting only wealthy urban customers was limiting. The true wealth lay in the rural masses. Dent's approach would transform opium from an urban vice into a national catastrophe. By producing cheaper, lower-quality opium, mixed with adulterants, his chemists created a product that delivered addictive effects at prices even small farmers and rural merchants could afford. This was not mere expansion, it was the industrialization of human misery. Dent's distribution network was equally ingenious. Instead of relying on established merchant networks, he recruited local addicts as sales agents, giving them free drugs in exchange for introducing opium to their communities. Each new customer became a potential dealer, spreading addiction through families and social networks with viral efficiency. His manipulation extended further. Agents were trained to exploit specific vulnerabilities. Farmers facing debt or crop failure were offered opium to calm anxiety. Soldiers burdened by combat stress were promised relief from nightmares. Women suffering domestic hardship were guided toward a temporary escape. And traditional medicine practitioners were targeted with fraudulent medical literature, convincing them that opium had healing properties for everything from chronic pain to digestive ailments. Dr. Li Shishon, a respected physician whose family had practiced medicine for 6 generations, became unwittingly entangled. When foreign pamphlets arrived claiming opium's medical virtues, Dr. Li studied them with the same rigor he applied to classical texts. The literature was sophisticated, complete with fabricated case studies and testimonials from supposed experts. With no reason to suspect deception, Dr. Li began recommending opium for patients with chronic pain or anxiety when other remedies had failed. At first, results seemed genuine. Pain eased, moods brightened. Dr. Li's reputation grew, as patients spread word of his access to powerful treatments. He did not know he was witnessing the first stages of addiction, not recovery. Tragically, his knowledge of anatomy and physiology made him particularly effective at creating dependence, prescribing doses that maximized the psychoactive effect while masking obvious intoxication. Within 2 years, Dr. Li's practice had shifted from a healing center to a distribution network, unknowingly serving hundreds of opium-dependent patients. The physician devoted to preserving life had, through no malicious intent, become an agent of destruction. When the truth became clear, the weight nearly drove him to despair. Stories like Dr. Li's multiplied across rural China, demonstrating the success of Deng's strategy to industrialize addiction on a national scale. By the early 1840s, opium use had spread from coastal cities into regions that had never known significant foreign influence. Entire provinces faced addiction rates threatening the maintenance of basic economic and social functions. The Chinese government's response to this crisis revealed a profound vulnerability. Traditional imperial administration, designed for centuries of internal challenges and occasional foreign intrusion, was ill-prepared to confront a modern threat, a combination of chemical dependency, commercial strategy, and military enforcement. The empire was now facing a new kind of warfare, one that attacked not armies or fortresses, but the minds, bodies, and social fabric of its people. Emperor Dao Guang and his advisors continued to approach the opium problem as if it were a matter of morality and law, something that could be solved by stricter enforcement and renewed virtue. They could not see, that they were facing an enemy that had weaponized addiction itself as a tool of imperial conquest. The rotation of new officials in Canton reflected not strategic planning, but the emperor's growing desperation. Each new commissioner arrived with high hopes and grand plans to end the opium trade, only to find that the crisis had grown far beyond the reach of traditional Chinese administrative methods. Commissioner Yang Fong, a seasoned military veteran who had quelled multiple rebellions, approached the problem as he would a domestic insurgency. He organized raids on opium dens, arrested known dealers, and imposed strict punishments on anyone caught using drugs. Against conventional crimes, his methods had succeeded. Against mass addiction, backed by foreign military power, they were painfully insufficient. Yang Fong's raids disrupted the distribution networks temporarily, but they also triggered a humanitarian crisis. Thousands of addicts were suddenly deprived of their supply, with no access to treatment for the withdrawal symptoms that consumed them. Hospitals across Canton overflowed with patients in physical and psychological torment, while prisons filled with people whose only crime was suffering from a condition inflicted by foreign merchants. Yang Fong's campaign revealed an essential truth: the opium crisis could not be treated as a matter of law enforcement. The real criminals were shielded by foreign governments and military forces, untouchable by traditional authority. Arresting Chinese addicts while their suppliers enjoyed immunity was like trying to hold back a flood by catching the water with one's hands. Yet the most sobering discovery awaited him within the halls of his own administration. As he sought to organize a crackdown, he found that many officials were addicted, reliant on daily opium and dependent on the very foreign dealers he sought to restrain. This corruption was deeper than bribery, it was a web of dependencies that made independent governance impossible. Officials tasked with enforcing anti-opium laws instead shielded the merchants who kept their addiction supplied, turning the machinery of government into a fragile tool of the very enterprise that was destroying society. This administrative paralysis was exactly what Jardine and Dent had anticipated when they targeted government officials as prime customers. An addicted bureaucracy could no longer oppose drug trafficking, no matter the edicts from Beijing. Every level of government was compromised, a structure built on public service transformed into a network of dependence on foreign criminal enterprises. The full scale became painfully clear when Yang Fong attempted to audit Canton's customs administration. Officials who should have been collecting duties on legitimate trade were instead facilitating opium smuggling in exchange for their daily drug supply. The imperial revenue system, designed to support the empire, had become a conduit for destruction from within. Yang Fong's reports to Beijing described a reality almost impossible for traditional Chinese political thought to grasp: the empire was being conquered not by foreign armies, but by foreign merchants wielding addiction as a weapon. For over 2 millennia, Confucian governance had guided Chinese administration. Yet it offered no tools to confront a modern form of psychological and economic warfare. The emperor's response revealed the limitations of this worldview. Rather than recognizing a new kind of attack, Dao Guang framed the crisis in familiar terms: moral corruption and administrative failure. Imperial edicts called for renewed Confucian virtue and stricter law enforcement, but offered nothing practical for treating addiction as a medical condition or countering foreign merchants who had effectively declared war. Chinese political culture was simply unprepared to conceive that substances could serve as weapons, or that civilians could be deliberately targeted for profit. The consequences of this conceptual failure extended far beyond opium. The inability to understand modern economic and psychological warfare would hinder China's responses to foreign aggression throughout the colonial period. Meanwhile, British forces were consolidating their control of Chinese coastal waters, preparing to expand their demands far beyond opium imports, aiming at a complete restructuring of China's relationship with foreign powers. The First Opium War had already evolved. What began as a dispute over drugs had become a comprehensive assault on Chinese sovereignty. Admiral George Eliot, following instructions from London, understood the broader goal. Military action against China was no longer just about protecting trade, it was about establishing British commercial and political dominance throughout East Asia. Each Chinese defeat strengthened Britain's leverage, enabling demands that would transform China from a fully independent empire into a semi-colonial dependency. The British strategy was precise and systematic. Rather than occupying territory indiscriminately, they targeted the foundations of resistance. Coastal fortifications were destroyed, naval yards burned, and commercial facilities seized or demolished to prevent use by Chinese forces. The most devastating aspect, however, was the deliberate targeting of civilian infrastructure, often with no military purpose, ensuring that the economic and social fabric of the empire itself would be weakened. The destruction of granaries that once fed bustling cities was not simply a matter of military strategy, it created food shortages that pressured Chinese authorities into negotiating under duress. Irrigation systems, the lifelines of farmland, were deliberately damaged, reducing the taxes that sustained Chinese military defenses. These tactics violated every principle of civilized warfare, yet they were frighteningly effective at breaking the will to resist. The human cost was immense, but carefully concealed from British public view, hidden behind censorship and propaganda. Newspapers described victories in glowing terms, omitting the suffering of ordinary people and the deliberate devastation of non-military targets that made those victories possible. Captain William Hutchin Hall, commanding the HMS Nemesis, later wrote in private letters that his missions had been designed as a form of systematic terror. The ship, equipped with cutting-edge naval technology, had overwhelming power over Chinese coastal defenses, yet the true purpose of each attack was to demonstrate Britain's willingness to use limitless force against civilians. The psychological effect on Chinese communities was profound. Officials who witnessed their towns reduced to ashes realized that continued resistance would bring even more suffering, while submission might limit the damage to levels they could manage. This grim calculus shaped Chinese negotiations for the rest of the war. But as British forces pursued their immediate goals, the long-term consequences quietly unfolded. The precedent of using military force to protect drug trafficking would echo through the colonial period, normalizing violence to maintain commercial relationships that were fundamentally exploitative. At the same time, British military victories accelerated the spread of opium addiction across China. Each captured port became a hub for distribution, with drugs flowing inland along trade routes and rivers, entwining military conquest and the addiction epidemic in a self-reinforcing cycle. The town of Ningbo, taken by British forces in October 1841, offers a vivid example. Within weeks, opium dealers, shielded by military protection, had set up operations throughout the city, targeting local merchants, artisans, and even surrendered soldiers. Jiang Mingshan, a Ningbo merchant, initially saw the British arrival as relief from wartime uncertainty. Yet he quickly realized the occupation brought something far worse: merchants interested not in fair trade, but in creating as many addicts as possible, using tactics designed to exploit the most vulnerable. Jiang Mingshan watched his neighborhood unravel. Families once prosperous through careful management fell into ruin as breadwinners spent their wages on opium instead of food or shelter. Children who should have been at school scavenged for anything to support their parents' addictions. The social fabric that had held Ningbo together weakened as opium replaced trust and obligation with dependency and desperation. Traditional authorities lost influence, replaced by informal power structures based on access to drugs rather than wisdom or moral guidance. New criminal networks emerged to serve the expanding market, generating violence and fear. Perhaps the most unsettling part of this transformation was how quickly ordinary people adapted to abnormal circumstances. Jiang Mingshan found himself accepting levels of misery that would once have been unimaginable, simply to cope with a reality that was too painful to confront. Across British-occupied China, communities were slowly normalizing what was, in fact, deliberate destruction. Addiction became an accepted part of daily life, while social systems adapted to survive rather than resist the epidemic. The economic effects were just as profound. Traditional commerce had relied on long-term trust, relationships built on reputation and mutual benefit. Opium addiction replaced this with short-term desperation, as people paid any price to relieve withdrawal. Merchants like Jiang Mingshan were forced to navigate a world where previously reliable partners became compulsive liars and thieves, and family businesses built over decades were destroyed. Commercial ethics were undermined, replaced by a system designed purely for profit by exploiting human weakness. The British model of occupation created an economic and social reality that favored exploitation over mutual benefit. It extended far beyond the opium trade itself, affecting every aspect of life under foreign control. This method, combining military force and systematic addiction, would become a blueprint for other European powers. It demonstrated that even well-organized civilizations could be subdued when addiction was wielded as a tool of imperial administration. Through this combination of violence, social disruption, and drugs, entire populations were coerced into submission. Addiction became normalized, military force became a tool of commerce, and human suffering was measured in profit margins. The precedent set in China would resonate throughout Asia, Africa, and beyond, teaching future empires that substances could be used to control societies as effectively as armies, and that the machinery of empire could weaponize human dependence itself. The destruction of granaries that once fed bustling cities was not simply a matter of military strategy, it created food shortages that pressured Chinese authorities into negotiating under duress. Irrigation systems, the lifelines of farmland, were deliberately damaged, reducing the taxes that sustained Chinese military defenses. These tactics violated every principle of civilized warfare, yet they were frighteningly effective at breaking the will to resist. The human cost was immense, but carefully concealed from British public view, hidden behind censorship and propaganda. Newspapers described victories in glowing terms, omitting the suffering of ordinary people and the deliberate devastation of non-military targets that made those victories possible. Captain William Hutchin Hall, commanding the HMS Nemesis, later wrote in private letters that his missions had been designed as a form of systematic terror. The ship, equipped with cutting-edge naval technology, had overwhelming power over Chinese coastal defenses, yet the true purpose of each attack was to demonstrate Britain's willingness to use limitless force against civilians. The psychological effect on Chinese communities was profound. Officials who witnessed their towns reduced to ashes realized that continued resistance would bring even more suffering, while submission might limit the damage to levels they could manage. This grim calculus shaped Chinese negotiations for the rest of the war. But as British forces pursued their immediate goals, the long-term consequences quietly unfolded. The precedent of using military force to protect drug trafficking would echo through the colonial period, normalizing violence to maintain commercial relationships that were fundamentally exploitative. At the same time, British military victories accelerated the spread of opium addiction across China. Each captured port became a hub for distribution, with drugs flowing inland along trade routes and rivers, entwining military conquest and the addiction epidemic in a self-reinforcing cycle. The town of Ningbo, taken by British forces in October 1841, offers a vivid example. Within weeks, opium dealers, shielded by military protection, had set up operations throughout the city, targeting local merchants, artisans, and even surrendered soldiers. Jiang Mingshan, a Ningbo merchant, initially saw the British arrival as relief from wartime uncertainty. Yet he quickly realized the occupation brought something far worse: merchants interested not in fair trade, but in creating as many addicts as possible, using tactics designed to exploit the most vulnerable. Jiang Mingshan watched his neighborhood unravel. Families once prosperous through careful management fell into ruin as breadwinners spent their wages on opium instead of food or shelter. Children who should have been at school scavenged for anything to support their parents' addictions. The social fabric that had held Ningbo together weakened as opium replaced trust and obligation with dependency and desperation. Traditional authorities lost influence, replaced by informal power structures based on access to drugs rather than wisdom or moral guidance. New criminal networks emerged to serve the expanding market, generating violence and fear. Perhaps the most unsettling part of this transformation was how quickly ordinary people adapted to abnormal circumstances. Jiang Mingshan found himself accepting levels of misery that would once have been unimaginable, simply to cope with a reality that was too painful to confront. Across British-occupied China, communities were slowly normalizing what was, in fact, deliberate destruction. Addiction became an accepted part of daily life, while social systems adapted to survive rather than resist the epidemic. The economic effects were just as profound. Traditional commerce had relied on long-term trust, relationships built on reputation and mutual benefit. Opium addiction replaced this with short-term desperation, as people paid any price to relieve withdrawal. Merchants like Jiang Mingshan were forced to navigate a world where previously reliable partners became compulsive liars and thieves, and family businesses built over decades were destroyed. Commercial ethics were undermined, replaced by a system designed purely for profit by exploiting human weakness. The British model of occupation created an economic and social reality that favored exploitation over mutual benefit. It extended far beyond the opium trade itself, affecting every aspect of life under foreign control. This method, combining military force and systematic addiction, would become a blueprint for other European powers. It demonstrated that even well-organized civilizations could be subdued when addiction was wielded as a tool of imperial administration. Through this combination of violence, social disruption, and drugs, entire populations were coerced into submission. Addiction became normalized, military force became a tool of commerce, and human suffering was measured in profit margins. The precedent set in China would resonate throughout Asia, Africa, and beyond, teaching future empires that substances could be used to control societies as effectively as armies, and that the machinery of empire could weaponize human dependence itself. The Shanghai docks were a world unlike anything Wang Ming had ever known. Here, the air hummed with constant activity, foreign sailors from Britain, India, and Southeast Asia moved alongside Chinese merchants, local laborers, and government officials. To a young man from a quiet farming village, this waterfront shimmered with excitement and possibility, a glimpse of China opening to the wider world. Yet beneath the energy of the harbor, the work Wang Ming performed was intimately tied to opium smuggling, hidden beneath the appearance of legitimate commerce. The warehouses where he loaded and unloaded cargo held secret compartments for drugs, and the offices where he delivered messages quietly functioned as distribution hubs, systematically addicting Chinese customers across the region. Most workers, including Wang Ming, had no idea they were involved in a trade that was quietly destroying society from within. They saw themselves as part of respectable trading companies, bringing prosperity to their families and communities, unaware of the criminal enterprise they were aiding. Foreign merchants had deliberately designed the system to recruit local collaborators without sparking moral resistance. Wang Ming's introduction to opium came gently, through workplace social gatherings that were presented as ordinary leisure. His supervisor, Lu Wensheng, a Chinese man already ensnared in addiction by foreign employers, hosted elaborate meals, entertainment, and what he called relaxation treatments to help employees cope with long hours and strenuous labor. The setting made drug use feel refined, sophisticated, and beneficial rather than dangerous. Lu Wensheng had transformed part of his home into a polished parlor, with elegant furniture and art suggesting wealth and taste. Opium pipes resembled traditional Chinese artistry, and the act of smoking was framed as meditation that improved both mind and body. Wang Ming's first encounter produced exactly the effects the foreign merchants had carefully optimized. Anxiety melted away, confidence and optimism flourished, and the physical strain of long dock hours vanished. Even more, opium seemed to smooth social connections, opening doors to better jobs, overtime opportunities, and inclusion in prosperous networks. To Wang Ming, the drug offered not just relief, but a path toward lifting his family from subsistence farming into a brighter economic life. This subtle psychological manipulation reflected decades of experience. Every detail, every gathering, every conversation, every ritual, was designed to foster positive associations with opium while concealing the growing dependency forming in Wang Ming's nervous system. Within 6 months, he was spending more on drugs than he earned, borrowing against future wages and selling personal belongings to maintain his supply. The ambitious young man who had left his village with dreams of progress was now trapped in debt and desperation, his efforts consumed by a cycle he could not escape. But Wang Ming's struggle did not end with himself, it spilled back into the village. Money he once sent home for farm improvements and household needs vanished, replaced by urgent requests for aid he could not meet. Once a symbol of hope, Wang Ming now weighed on the survival of his family. His father, Wang Jiabao, discovered the extent to which the opium trade had penetrated the economy. Each trip to Shanghai brought higher debts, more creditors, and financial obligations beyond comprehension. These creditors were no ordinary lenders. They were part of criminal organizations aligned with foreign opium merchants, creating debts that could never be repaid through ordinary means. Their system ensured that customers remained permanently dependent, while families like Wangjia's were drawn deeper into the financial and social consequences of addiction. Over time, the rice farm that had sustained generations was mortgaged to feed a habit carefully engineered to maximize dependence. The ripple effects were equally devastating socially. Neighbors who once respected the family avoided interactions that might entangle them in financial chaos. Traditional support networks that had helped communities endure floods, famines, and political upheavals began to break down. Village elders, wise and experienced, found themselves powerless against problems they could not address, addiction that required resources, knowledge, and influence far beyond what a rural community could offer. In this gentle, quiet devastation, one family's hope, a village's cohesion, and generations of social trust slowly eroded, all beneath the invisible hand of an economy designed to extract wealth while spreading dependency. Wang Ming's story, repeated across countless households, showed how deeply opium had woven itself into the fabric of Chinese life, reshaping society one addicted family at a time. The Confucian social systems that had kept rural life stable for centuries were not equipped to face a threat as insidious as this, medical conditions deliberately imposed by foreign powers as a tool of strategy. Wang Jiabao's desperate attempts to save his son led him to the foreign quarter of Shanghai, hoping to appeal to the merchants employing Wang Ming. But the officers he approached were already part of the same criminal enterprises that had created his family's suffering. To the foreign businessmen, Wangjia's distress was not a call for compassion, it was confirmation that their strategies were working exactly as intended. James Matt, who had taken over operations from Jardine after his return to Britain, received countless similar appeals from Chinese families whose lives were unraveling under the weight of addiction. In his private journals, Matt did not offer sympathy. Instead, he meticulously recorded observations on family structures, economic patterns, and social dynamics, using these insights to refine methods for extracting profit from human suffering while further weakening social cohesion. Every tragedy, like the Wangs, became part of a vast industrialized system of exploitation. The Treaty of Nanking had made this systematic destruction legal, granting military protection to the merchants carrying out these operations. Wangjia's pleas were not ignored by mere individuals, they were dismissed by representatives of a global system, sanctioned by one of the most powerful empires on earth. And while the treaty legitimized foreign control at the ports, the human cost multiplied beyond Shanghai. Each new distribution center extended the reach of addiction deeper into China's interior, destabilizing agricultural communities that had never encountered foreign influence. Take, for example, the Chen family of Suzhou. They were silk producers whose workshops had supplied luxury textiles throughout the Yangtze River Valley for over 2 centuries. Master Chen employed 40 skilled workers who had inherited exceptional techniques, preserving artistic traditions that reflected generations of craftsmanship. The opening of Shanghai's port seemed at first to offer new opportunities, as international buyers paid premium prices and expanded access to inland markets. But the foreign merchants who purchased Chen silk were not merely engaging in trade, they were methodically building channels for opium distribution. Every legitimate transaction created trust and access, establishing networks that could later introduce drugs into previously unreachable communities. Their strategy was patient and precise. Months of consistent orders, timely payments, and respectful engagement built relationships, while social gatherings gradually normalized opium use among influential business elites. The aim was not immediate addiction, but the slow creation of distribution networks anchored in social trust. Master Chen's first experience with opium came during a celebration dinner hosted by his largest foreign customer, marking the completion of a major export contract. The setting was elegant, culturally mindful, and designed to present opium as a refined, international practice that successful businessmen enjoyed together. The immediate effects were enticing. Master Chen felt relaxed, confident, and socially connected, while conversations about future opportunities flowed effortlessly, promising prosperity for his workshops. Within a year, however, he was hosting similar gatherings for fellow silk producers, unknowingly becoming a recruiter for the same networks that had ensnared him. The craftsman who had devoted his life to preserving Suzhou's traditional artistic excellence now facilitated the introduction of substances that threatened to destroy the very standards he had worked to uphold. Across China's manufacturing sectors, the story repeated itself. Skilled workers, once proud of their craft, were now preoccupied with earning money for drugs, while apprenticeship relationships, built on trust and mutual respect, deteriorated under the weight of addiction. The subtle transformation of Master Chen's workshops reflected a broader social shift, as opium silently eroded the human foundations of China's urban and rural economies alike. The economic consequences of opium addiction reached far beyond the walls of individual workshops. Suzhou's once celebrated reputation for producing the world's finest silk was beginning to falter. Addiction among workers lowered the quality of production and drove costs ever higher. Foreign merchants, who had previously paid premium prices for exceptional textiles, now found they could press suppliers for discounts, taking advantage of artisans too desperate to secure immediate cash. Yet the most profound damage was not merely economic. The cultural traditions that had made Chinese silk unique were slipping away. Techniques carefully preserved and refined over generations were being lost as master craftsmen became too impaired by opium to pass on their knowledge. Apprentices, more interested in obtaining their next dose than in learning, unwittingly participated in a slow erosion of centuries of skill. What was happening was cultural warfare in its quietest, most insidious form. Foreign drug dealers were not simply extracting wealth, they were dismantling the knowledge and capabilities that had made Chinese civilization distinct. Every addicted artisan represented generations of accumulated human achievement being sacrificed for foreign profit. This pattern repeated across China's traditional industries. Silk workshops were only the beginning. Furniture makers, metalworkers, and other skilled artisans experienced the same transformations. Communities producing some of humanity's most exquisite objects found their crafts and lives reshaped by drug dependency. The Chinese government's response revealed the depth of its paralysis. Imperial officials issued proclamations calling for renewed virtue and moral adherence, yet these gestures failed to address the systematic drug trafficking that made traditional craftsmanship unsustainable. Emperor Dao Guang's edicts, extolling Confucian principles, were increasingly irrelevant in towns and villages where addiction had fractured the social relationships that underpinned governance. Officials charged with enforcing these policies were themselves dependent on substances supplied by foreign interests. Local communities, lacking the resources or expertise to tackle problems requiring national coordination, were left vulnerable. The administrative system, which had governed China for over 2 millennia, was simply unprepared to confront enemies who waged war through commerce and chemistry. Traditional military and political strategies assumed threats would take recognizable forms, counterable through conventional means. The idea that foreign powers might target Chinese society through addiction and economic manipulation had never been seriously contemplated. The practical consequences were severe. Local magistrates receiving reports of widespread opium use had no legal or administrative framework to address an issue that combined medical, criminal, economic, and strategic elements. The knowledge and resources necessary to counter systematic drug trafficking simply did not exist within traditional Chinese governance. Meanwhile, British merchants continued expanding into regions that had never before encountered foreign influence, using the Treaty of Nanking to establish distribution networks deep within China's interior. The newly opened ports became launching points for methodical expansion. British merchants arrived with capital, connections, and local collaborators who could facilitate distribution while providing intelligence about community leaders and social structures. Recruitment targeted those whose positions or personalities made them particularly valuable for sustaining addiction networks. Struggling merchants were offered generous partnerships, providing immediate relief in exchange for future cooperation. Government officials, wary of their careers or family security, were approached with opportunities to supplement their income through consulting arrangements with foreign firms. These strategies were sophisticated and patient, reflecting the industrial-scale planning of the entire opium enterprise. Foreign merchants understood that penetrating Chinese society required the slow cultivation of relationships, gradual introduction of dependency, and careful avoidance of triggers that might inspire resistance. The ultimate goal, however, remained constant: the creation of self-sustaining networks of addiction that generated profits while weakening China's social cohesion and economic independence. Each new region that fell under foreign influence became a base for further expansion. Every new group of addicts provided both consumers and recruiters, allowing the criminal enterprise to grow organically. The human cost of this strategy was vast, as millions of Chinese discovered that their lives had become commodities in a global market, with suffering intentionally manufactured for foreign gain. The Treaty of Nanking had legalized this process, making it impossible for Chinese authorities to protect their own citizens from deliberate poisoning. Perhaps the most chilling aspect of the British approach was its long-term vision. The merchants and officials implementing these policies were aware that they were creating dependencies lasting generations, ensuring that Chinese society would remain subordinate to foreign interests long after the current leaders had passed. In quiet, deliberate ways, entire communities, industries, and traditions were being reshaped, leaving behind a world where economic, social, and cultural life was increasingly intertwined with the spread of opium. Addiction was no longer merely a tool for immediate profit. It was a way to subtly reshape the connection between Chinese civilization and the wider world. As the year 1843 began, the Second Opium War was still a few years away, but its roots were already quietly taking hold. The expansion of drug trafficking, legalized and made profitable by the treaties of the First Opium War, was systematically eroding Chinese resistance. Military defeat alone was not the only force at work. The chemical conquest of minds and bodies made opposition increasingly impossible, as entire communities found themselves entangled in dependency. This was the phase in which addiction became a weapon of empire, not simply a commodity. Substances were now tools of political control, reshaping societies to serve the interests of distant empires. The horror of the Opium Wars lay not only in the blatant human suffering, but in the revelation that even civilized nations could profit from such devastation. They exposed a vulnerability common to all societies: the human mind could become a battlefield, where wars were fought with chemistry rather than courage. The British expansion into China's heartland followed patterns that would later influence colonial domination across the world. What made this period particularly chilling was the way foreign merchants refined techniques for mass addiction, while Chinese society struggled to grasp the full nature of the assault. Imagine Nanjing in 1844, just 2 years after the Treaty of Nanking had legalized foreign drug trafficking. The ancient city, once a proud imperial capital, was quietly becoming a laboratory for addiction distribution, reaching populations long protected by distance and tradition. Here we meet Wang Xiao, a respected scholar and minor official whose family had served the imperial bureaucracy for 6 generations. Wang embodied the ideals of traditional Chinese education: classical learning, moral character, and dedication to public service. At 42, he oversaw tax collection for 3 rural counties and maintained a private school preparing young men for the imperial examinations. Wang's world began to shift when foreign merchants arrived in Nanjing, armed with documents from the British consulate permitting them to establish trading operations across the region. These were no longer the rough smugglers of Canton's back alleys. These were sophisticated businessmen fluent in Chinese language and customs, presenting themselves as partners in China's modernization rather than exploiters of its weaknesses. The leader of this group was Thomas Dent, nephew of the opium magnate Lancelot Dent. His approach to market expansion represented a new evolution in drug trafficking strategy. Unlike his uncle, who had targeted desperate addicts with cheap opium, Thomas focused on recruiting influential Chinese figures, scholars, officials, and merchants, who could legitimize opium use among the educated elite and provide access to social networks that foreign merchants could not reach directly. Thomas Dent first met Wang Xiao during a formal reception hosted by Nanjing's prefect to welcome foreign merchants. The occasion was designed to show mutual respect between Chinese and British cultures, combining elaborate diplomatic protocol with a subtle celebration of the commercial opportunities that the Treaty of Nanking had created. During their conversation, Thomas demonstrated deep knowledge of Chinese literature and philosophy, discussing classical texts with the same sophistication Wang prized in his fellow scholars. This display of intellectual compatibility created an immediate rapport. Dent's respect for Chinese culture suggested that foreign commerce could enhance, rather than threaten, traditional values. Yet Thomas's knowledge was not the result of genuine curiosity. It was the product of systematic intelligence gathering, reflecting a strategy carefully crafted by British merchants who understood that successful penetration of Chinese society required a detailed understanding of the cultural mechanisms holding communities together. Every word, every gesture of respect, and every carefully orchestrated display of cultural sensitivity was designed to identify vulnerabilities that could later be used to expand drug distribution networks. The recruitment process was gradual and subtle. Wang never recognized it as recruitment at all. Thomas invited him to informal gatherings where foreign and Chinese intellectuals discussed literature, philosophy, and the potential benefits of increased cultural exchange. These gatherings, held in elegant surroundings, suggested sophistication and success. While the conversations engaged Wang's genuine interests and aspirations, opium was quietly introduced, framed as an aid to intellectual discourse rather than a recreational drug. Thomas Dent introduced opium to Wang Xiao as a substance that could enhance mental clarity and spark creative thinking, sharing stories of European scholars who claimed the drug sharpened their philosophical insight and literary talents. The opium pipes and ornate equipment resembled the traditional accessories of Chinese scholars, and the act of smoking was presented as a form of meditation, complementing rather than conflicting with Confucian practices. Wang's first experiences seemed to confirm these claims. Opium eased the chronic anxiety he had carried since managing taxes in regions troubled by poor harvests and banditry. It seemed to sharpen his mind, making complex administrative challenges feel manageable and even inspiring the writing of essays and poetry essential to his scholarly reputation. Within months, Wang found himself hosting similar gatherings at his own home, introducing colleagues, government officials and scholars, to the drug with his trusted guidance. The once dedicated civil servant was unknowingly becoming a recruitment agent for foreign powers, quietly undermining the Chinese government. At first, colleagues barely noticed changes in Wang's behavior. His work even appeared improved in some ways. Opium gave him confidence and focus he had never experienced before. But these small gains hid a deeper truth: dependency was growing, silently shaping his life and his ability to function without the drug. The very traits that had made Wang Xiao valuable, intellectual curiosity, desire for improvement, and commitment to serving the community, were precisely those that made him vulnerable to manipulation. Thomas Dent had spotted these qualities, turning a loyal official into an unwitting collaborator in a campaign that eroded Chinese administrative power. Wang Xiao's story was only a single thread in a vast web of addiction spreading through China's government. In Beijing, imperial officials meant to coordinate responses to foreign penetration were themselves becoming dependent on substances supplied by foreign merchants. Even the Forbidden City was not immune. Advisors like Grand Secretary Majanga, a trusted aide to Emperor Dao Guang, found their judgment compromised as addiction seeped into the highest levels of governance. Introduced under the guise of socially appropriate gatherings, drugs became a more effective tool than bribes for securing cooperation. The insidious effect was not just financial corruption, it was psychological dependency, making independent thought impossible for officials holding crucial positions. Those who should have safeguarded Chinese interests were instead protecting the network supplying their opium. This administrative paralysis was exactly the outcome British strategists had intended. An empire whose officials were addicted to substances controlled by enemies could not resist foreign demands, no matter what policies were issued from the throne or what resources were theoretically available. The depth of this problem became painfully clear when Emperor Dao Guang attempted to assess foreign commercial activities in the treaty ports. Officials tasked with gathering accurate intelligence were instead shielding the networks they were meant to monitor. Reports were carefully falsified, concealing the scale of drug trafficking. The most devastating effect, however, was on China's ability to understand its own crisis. Intelligence networks, designed to provide early warning, were now feeding foreign merchants information to expand their reach and refine recruitment strategies. Meanwhile, the human cost multiplied in regions previously untouched by foreign influence. Consider the Lu family, tea merchants from Hangzhou. Their trade had linked famous tea gardens with buyers across the Yangtze River Valley for over 4 generations, employing 30 people and supporting dozens of farming families. Lu Wenjiang's reputation for honest dealing had made his family name synonymous with excellence. The arrival of foreign commerce seemed at first a golden opportunity. Premium prices for high-quality tea and access to international markets promised growth and prosperity. But the merchants approaching Lu Wenjiang were not there merely to trade. Tea transactions were a cover for building opium distribution networks, using his warehouses, transportation routes, and business relationships to introduce drugs into the community. The integration of legitimate and illegal commerce was subtle. Lu Wenjiang believed he was expanding his tea business, not participating in a criminal enterprise. The foreign merchants had perfected the art of gradual recruitment, ensuring moral resistance never flared. Lu's first inkling came during a celebratory dinner after a major export contract, when his partner, Richardson, mentioned needing temporary storage for special merchandise under international regulations. It sounded plausible and profitable. Lu agreed, seeing it as extra income to strengthen his legitimate business. What Lu did not realize was that these shipments contained opium, hidden among tea containers, becoming the backbone of a growing distribution network in Hangzhou. Slowly, changes appeared, employees grew erratic and desperate, tensions rose, and the previously smooth operation of his warehouses faltered. Lu Wenjiang realized with horror that his business was being used to destroy the very community it had served for generations. Yet the financial dependence on Richardson made ending the relationship impossible, threatening both his livelihood and the families who relied on his trade. This personal dilemma mirrored a larger pattern throughout China. Foreign merchants used similar tactics in every treaty port, converting legitimate businesses into drug distribution networks without triggering immediate resistance. Each successful recruitment created new pressure points for expanding influence, making it increasingly difficult for communities to resist. Thomas Dent's success in Nanjing and Richardson's operations in Hangzhou were carefully studied and replicated, creating a coordinated expansion of addiction along commercial networks. Ultimately, the goal was not merely to sell drugs, it was to weaken the social fabric of Chinese society. Every addicted official, every corrupted business, every family disrupted represented progress toward permanent dependency on foreign control. The human cost of this systematic assault was mounting, as addiction spread from urban centers to rural communities, quietly reshaping the heart of China while the world looked on. The quiet villages that had nurtured their traditional ways of life for centuries were beginning to feel gentle tremors of change that threatened their basic stability. Increasing numbers of young men were leaving for the cities, seeking work, and finding themselves caught in the subtle yet relentless web of foreign drug trafficking operations that had grown up around the treaty ports. Consider the Jiang family, who lived in a farming village outside Suzhou. Their story reflects the slow, creeping disruption of agricultural communities that had long sustained China's population. Jiang Yut had tended the same rice paddies his ancestors had worked for 8 generations, upholding farming practices that had carried the village through wars, famines, and political upheavals that had reshaped Chinese society countless times. His village was a place of stability and endurance, where extended families supported each other through the cycles of seasons and shared the wisdom of agriculture, craftsmanship, and social life across generations. This intricate web of relationships had kept the community resilient and secure, providing meaning to lives tied closely to the land and the continuity of tradition. But such stability drew the quiet attention of foreign merchants who understood that disrupting rural communities was key to undermining Chinese resistance. Villages that remained independent and cohesive could organize against foreign penetration, while those unraveling under addiction would focus only on personal survival, leaving them vulnerable. The first ripple of disruption in the Jiang family came through Jiang Yud's eldest son, Jiang Ming, who ventured to Suzhou in search of work. Intelligent, diligent, and devoted to his family, Jiang Ming had hoped to learn new skills and build connections so that he could eventually return and enhance the prosperity of his household. Yet the jobs available to ambitious young men were increasingly linked to foreign enterprises designed to weave workers into drug distribution networks. Traditional opportunities were shrinking, replaced by positions in operations where legitimate business and opium trade were intertwined. Jiang Ming found employment at a silk warehouse, outwardly run by Chinese merchants but secretly owned by British investors using silk exports as a cover for opium imports. His duties, loading cargo, managing inventory, and delivering messages, seemed like exactly the sort of work that could provide steady income and teach modern business skills. Yet the warehouse was part of a carefully constructed criminal network, blending commerce with addiction to create dependency and loyalty to foreign powers. The supervisors had been trained to identify young men like Jiang Ming, responsible, ambitious, family-oriented, and to introduce them to opium through subtle social strategies. His first encounter with the drug came during workplace gatherings presented as normal, even celebratory, aspects of life in a modern business. Wu Chang'eng, his supervisor, had been deliberately addicted as part of a strategy to manage employees. Wu hosted elaborate meals and entertainment, framing opium use as a way to relieve stress and maintain the focus required for demanding work. The manipulation was delicate. Opium was never forced or overtly praised, rather, it was woven into social situations where participation appeared natural and sophisticated. Young men eager to prove themselves, like Jiang Ming, joined in without fully understanding the long-term consequences. At first, the effects seemed entirely beneficial. Opium lifted his confidence, eased homesickness, and smoothed his relations with co-workers and supervisors, creating a sense of belonging that softened the difficult transition from rural to urban life. From Jiang Ming's perspective, everything seemed to be falling into place. The money he earned and sent home allowed his father to improve farming operations and provide educational opportunities for his younger siblings. His hopes for the family were being realized, and life seemed to follow the plan he had envisioned. Yet beneath the surface, a subtle dependency was forming in his nervous system. The initial surge of energy and confidence gave way, over time, to anxiety and fatigue when the drug's effects faded, drawing him into a cycle of increasing consumption just to feel normal. Within a year, the cost of opium outstripped his wages. He borrowed against future earnings and sold personal possessions, all to maintain his supply. The bright promise of city life, meant to lift his family from subsistence, had quietly turned into a trap of debt and addiction, one that would touch not just him but the entire community he had hoped to support. The transformation that overtook Jiang Ming was quietly devastating, touching the very core of his sense of identity and purpose. The young man who had left his village with hopes of lifting his family from hardship was slowly becoming an addict, seeing his relatives not as loved ones but as sources of money to sustain his habit. His letters home grew increasingly elaborate and misleading, weaving stories that concealed the truth while pressing for financial help. Back in the village, Jiang Yud faced choices that no parent should ever have to make. His son's requests for money grew larger and more urgent, while the explanations grew thinner and less believable. The rice fields that had nourished their family for generations were gradually being consumed to feed an addiction that Jiang Yud could not fully understand, let alone address. And it was not just his family. The social networks that had once helped farming communities weather difficult seasons were fraying as similar tragedies struck other households whose children had sought employment in the expanding treaty port economy. Even the village's traditional authority figures, elders who had guided their people through floods, famines, and political upheavals, found themselves powerless against a new kind of crisis. The Confucian social systems that had sustained rural stability for centuries were unprepared to address problems deliberately created by foreign enemies, using tools and methods that previous generations had never encountered. The elders had no framework for understanding a form of chemical warfare conducted through business and social relationships. Desperate to save his son, Zhang Yud journeyed to Suzhou, seeking understanding and solutions. But the city he entered was itself quietly reshaped by foreign operations, designed to weaken the social ties and economic foundations that had long made urban life stable and prosperous. The Suzhou of Zhang Yud's imagination, an inspiring center of culture and commerce, was becoming a laboratory for subtle techniques of social control. Opium dens dotted neighborhoods, their patrons ensnared in substances that dulled resistance to exploitation. Legitimate businesses were slowly converted into criminal enterprises that served foreign interests rather than the welfare of local people. As Zhang Yud searched for help, he discovered that traditional Chinese institutions were being steadily undermined. Government officers, meant to safeguard citizens, were often themselves dependent on foreign-supplied drugs, entangled in the very networks destroying their communities. Schools and religious centers, once pillars of moral guidance, were infiltrated by foreign influences promoting values incompatible with Chinese social stability. He found no authority figures both willing and able to address the crisis consuming his family. Magistrates expressed sympathy but claimed that opium trafficking was legally protected, while religious leaders acknowledged the moral dangers but lacked the resources to provide medical treatment for the addictions that now afflicted entire communities. Most chilling of all, Zhang Yud realized his son's fate was neither rare nor unexpected. Thousands of young men from rural villages were following the same path, from hopeful workers to desperate addicts, whose families were bankrupted and broken. The pattern was so pervasive that it seemed almost natural, as if addiction were an inevitable byproduct of modernization, rather than a deliberately orchestrated condition designed to serve foreign strategic interests. The normalization of this tragedy was perhaps the most insidious aspect of the foreign operations. Communities were slowly adapting to levels of suffering once unimaginable, cultivating cultural and social practices that accepted mass addiction as a permanent feature of life, rather than a crisis to be confronted. The economic consequences were equally stark. Traditional Chinese commerce relied on long-term relationships built on trust, reputation, and mutual benefit. Addiction, however, created markets dominated by desperation, where customers would pay any price for immediate relief, and ethical business practices became obstacles to profit rather than the foundation of sustainable exchange. In Suzhou, Zhang Yud observed this shift everywhere he went. Merchants once committed to building enduring relationships now focused on extracting maximum payment from those too vulnerable to resist. The social trust that had kept Chinese commercial life stable and prosperous was being quietly eroded, one desperate transaction at a time. Perhaps the most heartrending realization for Zhang Yud was that his family's tragedy was part of a much larger transformation reshaping Chinese civilization itself. The epidemic of addiction was not merely destroying individuals or communities, it was systematically dismantling the cultural mechanisms that had preserved Chinese society across centuries. Young men like Jiang Ming were more than unfortunate victims, they were representatives of entire generations whose potential to contribute to culture, governance, and community was being systematically erased. Foreign powers had discovered that the surest way to conquer a civilization was to corrode the minds and spirits of its youth, breaking the chains of tradition and knowledge that tied generations together. When Zhang Yud returned to his village, he did so without his son, carrying the painful understanding of a truth far larger than any one family. This was not merely a commercial dispute, nor a challenge that could be solved through treaties or policy adjustments. It was a systematic assault on Chinese civilization, conducted in ways that made conventional resistance nearly impossible, and that ensured each new generation would face even greater vulnerability to foreign domination than the one before. The Treaty of Nanking had made legal the quiet, systematic destruction of Chinese society, while granting military protection to the foreign merchants carrying out these plans. But the real sorrow lay not only in what was happening to China, it was in what these events revealed about the willingness of supposedly civilized nations to use any means, no matter how cruel or destructive, to maintain economic and political advantage over others. The tale of how addiction became a weapon of empire was entering its most troubling chapter, as foreign powers showed that entire civilizations could be subdued not only through military might, but through the careful corruption of human minds and bodies, creating conditions where resistance became psychologically impossible. The techniques honed in China would eventually spread across the colonial world, normalizing the use of substances and dependency as instruments of imperial control. As 1845 began, the full scope of this tragedy was still unfolding. The Second Opium War was over a decade away, yet its roots were already being set through the systematic expansion of addiction, made legal and profitable by the First Opium War treaties. Chinese society was quietly transforming from within, influenced by foreign powers who sought to make independence impossible, ensuring that each new generation inherited problems beyond the capacity of traditional solutions. The human cost was growing, as millions of people discovered their lives had become commodities in a global market where suffering was intentionally created and maintained for profit. And yet, the lessons from China's misfortune would be applied wherever empires sought to control populations, exploiting vulnerability and human dependency to extract wealth. The methods of imperial control perfected during this period were far subtler than mere military occupation or economic exploitation. What made the late 1840s especially haunting was how foreign powers learned to weaponize human psychology, turning social bonds and cultural traditions into exploitable vulnerabilities. Take, for example, Dr. Peter Parker, an American missionary whose medical work in Canton unintentionally contributed to these strategies. Standing at the bedside of patients in his small clinic, Dr. Parker believed he was serving God, healing the sick, and showing Christian compassion to people who had never encountered Western medicine. Yet his careful medical records were studied by British intelligence officers, who recognized that details about family relationships, economic dependencies, and social hierarchies could guide the most effective addiction distribution campaigns. Every patient who shared intimate personal details unknowingly provided data to criminal enterprises, helping foreign merchants destroy communities with precision. Among Dr. Parker's most valuable patients, from a strategic perspective, was Commissioner Lin Zexu himself. Once a moral crusader who had risked everything to oppose foreign opium, Lin now suffered chronic pain after his exile, and his consultations with Dr. Parker revealed vital insights into the psychological state of Chinese officials who had resisted foreign influence. The irony was profound. Lin Zexu, who had fought to protect his people, was receiving medical care from a man whose observations were now being used to refine the very systems that had undermined him. Dr. Parker's role extended beyond individual patients. As a trusted foreign physician, he gained access to social circles typically closed to merchants. Chinese patients, confident in his care and compassion, shared intimate details about communities, families, and social hierarchies across southern China. British merchants and their intelligence networks compiled this information to understand which families controlled local commerce, which officials faced financial pressure, which young men were discontent with traditional careers, and which communities harbored social tensions. This intelligence guided systematic recruitment and addiction campaigns, ensuring maximum disruption and profit. The strategies emerging from this intelligence were remarkably sophisticated. Drugs were not distributed at random. Key figures, government officials, influential merchants, and respected scholars, were carefully targeted, as their addiction could ripple across communities, weakening social cohesion and economic stability. What began with William Jardine's deliberate cruelty in Canton became a blueprint for a new form of imperial domination, one that could quietly dismantle entire civilizations from within. The story of the Opium Wars reminds us of a terrifying truth: civilizations can be undone not only by armies or economic pressure, but by the intimate vulnerabilities of human nature itself. The methods perfected in China did not vanish when the last treaty was signed. Instead, they evolved, spreading and adapting, finding new forms throughout the colonial world and leaving a legacy that would echo across generations. The very same psychological manipulation that had transformed Chen Wei from a respected, successful merchant into a desperate addict. The very same systematic targeting of social institutions that had unraveled Master Hang's workshop. The very same weaponization of human dependency that had brought hardship and bankruptcy to Jiang Yud's family. These methods quietly became the standard tools of imperial control, applied wherever foreign powers sought to break the spirit of local communities and suppress resistance. Even today, when we observe communities torn apart by addiction, when we notice the calculated targeting of vulnerable populations with substances designed to create dependency, when we see economic desperation leveraged to erode social cohesion, we are witnessing the enduring legacy of what began, over 2 centuries ago, in the warehouses and offices of Canton. The Opium Wars were never just about China, and they were never only about history. They were about a chilling revelation, that human minds and bodies could themselves become battlegrounds, where victories were won not through courage or military skill, but through chemistry and carefully calculated cruelty. The millions of Chinese people who suffered, who fell into addiction, and who perished, were not only casualties of imperial ambition, they were, in effect, test subjects in a vast experiment, demonstrating that even entire civilizations could be subdued by turning the natural bonds of humanity against themselves. To understand this history is not only to honor those who endured such suffering. It is also to recognize the patterns that persist in our world today, and to cultivate the wisdom needed to resist forces that seek to use our deepest human needs as instruments of control. The price of empire, measured in human anguish and loss, remains as painfully relevant now as it was when the first opium ships quietly sailed into Chinese waters, carrying with them a cargo of deliberate destruction and social upheaval.